In this video, we are going to talk about natural selection and the theory of evolution. So evolution is this theory that an organism's inherited traits or genetic composition have changed over time. So I'm sure you've heard of evolution. Many scientists believe that this is how organisms have changed and developed over time. As you can kind of see, this is just an example picture of one organism that that's characteristics have shifted and changed because of genetic variation and evolved into pretty much a whole new species over time. So in 1809, before evolution was even thought about, John Baptiste de Lamarck had this hypothesis of inheritance of acquired traits. And so he thought that traits developed during a parent's lifetime were inherited by its offspring. So, for example, if a dad had developed really large muscles built by hard work, that those could be passed down to the offspring. But his hypothesis was actually not correct. This is not how traits are passed down. These traits are not inherited, so evidence did not support his hypothesis. So Charles Darwin, this is a picture of him. He was a scientist, and we're going to talk a little bit about his model of evolution. So in December of 1831, Charles Darwin, who was this naturalist, this scientist, explored the Galapagos Islands, and he found that there was a variety of life there that he had not seen in any other places. He had been to South America, and certain organisms that were on the Galapagos Islands were not in South America. So it was like this different place that he hadn't seen certain organisms before. And one specific organism that he observed was the finch, which is a type of bird. So he found that there was 13 species in all, and all of the species were similar, except they had differences in body size, their beak shape, and their eating habits. And so you can kind of see a few different pictures of these different finches and what their beaks look like. So Darwin reasoned that the Galapagos finches must have had to compete for food since there were 13 different species. So they had this competition going on for who would get food. And so the finches with the beak shapes that allowed them to eat available food were the ones that survived longer and produced more offspring than finches without those beak shapes, which makes sense. Finches who had certain beaks allowed them to get certain food, and then they, when they competed with other organisms, they're the ones that kind of won the competition because their beaks were better for that particular food. And then after all these generations, Darwin reasoned that these groups of finches became a whole separate species. And that's kind of what happened on the island. So natural selection fits in with Darwin's theory, and natural selection says that organisms with traits best suited to their environment are the ones that are more likely to survive and reproduce. So these traits from these organisms are passed down to more offspring, and these organisms produce more offspring than survive. They have to produce more offspring than survive. So this is just an example of natural selection that Darwin observed with the finches. The Galapagos finches lay several eggs every few months, and Darwin realized that in just a few years, several pairs of the finches could produce a very large population. And these members of the large population would have to compete, like we talked about before, for living space, food, and other resources. And the finches that were best able to survive were the ones that were more likely to produce because they were alive and pass on these specific traits that allowed them to survive to the next generation. So that's how these traits were passed down. And then organisms that didn't have these particular traits were ones that were more likely to die off or go extinct. Okay, so we're just going to talk about 5 principles of natural selection. First principle, organisms produce more offspring than can survive. These are the organisms that continue on. Differences or variations occur among individuals of a species, and some of these variations are passed to offspring, because remember, in meiosis, genetic variation is very random. They could get certain traits, but they couldn't get other traits. It occurs randomly. So some of these variations are helpful, and individuals with the helpful variations survive and reproduce better than those without these variations. And over time, the offspring of individuals with helpful variations, or adaptations as we will call them later on, make up more of a population and eventually may become a separate species. So these principles are what Charles Darwin kind of developed over the years. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about is variation and adaptation according to evolution. So variation, this is just an inherited trait that makes an individual different from other members of its species. So when we think about humans, humans have lots and lots of variations with all our different traits. So these variations result from permanent changes or mutations in an organism's gene. So small variations could be like the shape of human hairlines, and then large variations could be like fruit with no seeds or an albino squirrel. So remember, these mutations just randomly happen. It's not anything that's planned, it just randomly happens in the cell. So over time, more and more individuals of the species might inherit these gene variations. And if organisms with these variations continue to survive and reproduce over many generations, Charles Darwin suggested and reasoned that a new species can evolve because of this. And Darwin said that it might take hundreds, thousands, or even millions of years for a new species to evolve. So that is why many scientists believe that humans have evolved from monkeys, because of this variation. Adaptations are a little bit different. This is any variation that makes an organism better suited to its environment. So adaptations are helpful things. And the variations that result in an adaptation can involve an organism's color, shape, behavior, or chemical makeup. And we know that an example of adaptations are camouflage, as you can see in this picture. That is it for this video. When you are finished, you can make sure you have all the notes completed, and you can take the natural selection review quiz up to 3 times to get your best score.